The concept of limitation is only within the context of physical. In the physical world, which is finite, there's limitation. In the spiritual world, which is not finite, the concept of less cannot hold more has no relevance. I'll give you an example. God comes to Noach and tells him he should build an ark. And because if the members of the generation don't repent, he will destroy the world. And the value of that ark is that all species, non-kosher species, kosher species, a representation of each of the grouping will go into that ark. 2 of the non-kosher, male and female, 7 of the kosher. Now, how large was the ark? 60 cubits long, 50 cubits wide, 30 cubits high. Not very large. A cubit is maximum 22 inches. 60 times 22, 50 wide, 30 high. Every species, domesticated, undomesticated, birds, reptiles, insects, went in. 7 of the kosher all went into this small structure. Food to feed all these species went into this structure, into this little edifice. It was 3 floors. The upper floor was for the Noach and his family. The second floor was for all the living creatures. As I said, the reptiles, domestic, undomesticated birds, and insects. The lowest level was for all the waste. There's not much room in there. Does anybody stop to think for a moment? You know, they just kept going through that front door. But area-wise, it was not able to contain not a fraction of what went in there, but it just kept going in. The ark was able to contain whatever went into it. How? Could you put more than an ounce into an ounce glass? It's not possible. Everything has a capacity, has a limit. The concept of limitation is only within a finite world, which is the physical world. Within the spiritual realm, everything is unlimited. Although the ark itself was built, made of wood, but the context of what was inside there was a spiritual context. Therefore, it was unlimited. This is similar to what we read in Pirkei Avos, that one of the miracles of the temple was that when the Jews were in the temple on Yom Kippur, Obdim Tzvufim, they would stand pressed together, but when they would prostrate themselves, there was enough place for everybody to prostrate themselves. When they would hear the pronouncement of God's name by the high priest, how did it happen? One moment they're pressed, literally, to the point where you can lift off your feet and you're not going to fall. That's how pressed together you are. But when it came time to prostrate themselves, there was enough room for prostration. You realize the walls didn't expand. So how did it happen? The answer is that although the temple was made of marble and stone, but what was the context of that edifice? Spiritual. It's God's location. Within a spiritual context, there's no limitation. But how does it work? What's the mechanism? We are physical beings. Our grasp, our understanding is only within the physical realm. We can't even approach it to understand how something of limit has no limit. The ark has no limit. Although it was made of wood and there were certain specifications, does make a difference. Adam and Eve were created, put into the Garden of Eden. Cain, the first child, the first human being to be born of human beings. The day he was conceived, that's the day he was born. There was no gestation period. Torah speaks about a woman conceives, 9 months later she gives birth, all kinds of laws which pertain to this. Pre-sin of Adam, there's no such thing. Everything was instantaneous. Conception, birth, you're already like an adult, like an animal. The animal from conception, there is gestation by an animal too. But once it's born, it's not far from what it's supposed to be. The horse, the colt, the day it's born, it already stands on its feet. Other species, 2-3 days later, it doesn't recognize their mother any longer. That's how quickly they become independent. The human being was that initially before the sin of Adam. Why? But how does it happen so quickly? Because within a spiritual context, there's no such time means nothing. Everything's instantaneous. I'd mentioned that the Torah tells us God took Adam and put him in the Garden of Eden. It says he took him. If you read the word take, it means he picked him up. God's the creator. Picked him up, put him in the Garden of Eden. Like you put something on a shelf, or you take an unintelligible creature, a dog, you pick it up and you put it where you want to put the dog or the bird or whatever it may be. So it says God took Adam, put him in the Garden of Eden. What does it mean he took him? So the Midrash tells us he persuaded him. He persuaded him to go into the Garden of Eden by explaining to him the value of coming into existence. Until Adam was put in the Garden of Eden, it was not a functional being. The human being only functions within its own habitat. What's the habitat of human being? Being brought into existence. When God put Adam into the Garden of Eden, he was brought into existence. Now his function as a being of choice came into being. So God said to him, God took him. The word taking means he persuaded him. So I explained, what is choice? Choice means I see both sides of the equation, and because one side of the equation weighs more heavily than the other, I favor that side. So that's my choice. I chose based on my evaluation to choose to do whatever I choose to do, right or left. What about if one side of the choice is so overwhelmingly greater than the other because you appreciate it to such a degree, there's no choice. As we say, it's an offer we can't turn down. That's how overwhelming it is, why you take advantage of that. God persuaded Adam to such a point where basically he had no choice. So what did God do? It's the equivalent. He put him there. He put him there because it was not his own initiative to go there. Of course it was, but it was only because God persuaded him and convinced him to understand it's in his best interest to be there. That's the expression, he took him. Except like in the vernacular, when a person is deceived and fooled and victimized, he says, I've been taken. That's in the negative. That's the negative connotation. You have a person who's a con man, he cons him, and the person doesn't realize before he turns around how he's victimized because he didn't see it coming. He was so convinced. The kach, he was taken by God, means he was convinced of the value and the positiveness and the infinite benefit and privilege. Therefore, Adam says he was taken. He had no choice. It's an offer which is impossible to turn down. We find that same expression. God says to Moshe, take your brother Aaron and install him as high priest. Rashi says the same thing. Persuade him. Explain to him what it means to be the high priest, be the officiant of God, to be able to enter into the Holy of Holies on Yom Kippur, to bring about atonement for the entire Jewish people, what the value of that is. That's persuasion that he's taken. He's convinced beyond convincing. There's no alternative after appreciating and understanding what that opportunity is. So it's interesting. For Adam to be introduced into existence, he had to be agreeable to it. He wasn't forced to come into existence. He was persuaded. It was through his own volition now, he enters into the Garden of Eden. But once existence begins, and we're already in existence, we read in Pirkei Avos, against your will you're born, against your will you live, and against your will you die. Once you arrive, or even before you arrive, at the time of conception, it's just a question of time before that child's going to be born. That child who was conceived has no choice but to be born. That's Bal Korchach Atonolad. Against your will, you're born. Now that you're born into existence, does a person have a choice to live or die? Of course, God forbid a person could take his life. But naturally, instinctively, nobody wants to die. So really, the psyche of a human being is, through thick and thin, I'm somehow going to live through this. Despite the deprivations or the sufferings of life, most people don't take their lives. As much as you want to remain here, when it's time to pass on, a person has no choice. When, as they say, when it's checkout time, you're out. God forbid. The time of demise comes, person dies. But initially, to come into existence, that's Adam's choice. That had to be through his own volition. Once you're here, now you're here means all humanity is here. All your descendants are here. Till the end of time. Now it's against your will you born, against your will you live, against your will you die. Before the sin of the tree of knowledge, Adam was able to see from one end of the world to the other. Again, although it was a physical world, it was made up of earth, but its context was all spiritual. Therefore, there were no limitations, there were no barriers. He was able to see from one end of the world to the other. There was no blockage. As I said, Cain, from conception to birth, was instantaneous. Because time doesn't reign. It's not a question of time. Post-sin, Adam no longer has that clarity. Because Adam has been relatively physicalized. He's become a physical being. And within physicality, there's limitation. There are barriers. There's unknowns. Just as before the eating of the ancient tree of knowledge, evil was not part of the makeup of the person. It was external. And therefore, he had black and white clarity. Discernment was literally almost absolute. Once he ingested that evil, everything turns gray. The clarity is not there any longer. Now you have all these conflicts. But the conflicts are only due to because you become this physical being. Evil has no relevance to spirituality. It's the vacuum of spirituality. It's due to the vacuum of spirituality. Therefore, you have confusion, you have grayness. But there is black and white. It's very interesting. Within the context of Torah, you ask a person a halachic question. Is it permitted or not permitted? What is the answer? The answer is yes or no. It's either permitted, not permitted. There's no gray. It's very discernible, distinct, and exact. And that's exactly, there's no confusion. Confusion is only as a result of a lack of understanding. If you don't understand, therefore, you don't know if it's right, it's wrong, it's left or right. The Torah tells us that you're not permitted to deviate from the words of the rabbis. And if they tell you your left is your right is your left, you must heed their word. So you'd say, it's a bunch of nonsense. They tell me my left is my right and my right is my left. Even that you must follow them. How's that possible? So the Midrash tells us when a person thinks his left is his right, sometimes he doesn't understand. His left is really his right and his right is his left. The rabbis who have that level of clarity and they understand on this absolute level, what you think is what is not what you believe it is. A person eats food and he believes it's nourishing and healthy and will extend his life. But because he has no understanding of nutrition, he doesn't realize it's clogging his arteries and he's only lived 50% of his lifetime. But he believes what he's doing is the right thing. But the ones who understand what it's about understand what you consider healthy is unhealthy, and what you consider unhealthy is really what's healthy. So the expert has the clarity. You being not the expert, it's around what you believe. The question is what the reality is. Within the realm of spirituality, you only see reality. Within the realm of physicality, everything is a fog. And you have to somehow pierce the veil to get some level of clarity. What is the mechanism to pierce that veil? You know, years ago, there's no such thing as fog lights. Sometimes the fog is so thick, you can put the beam of the car, it doesn't pierce the fog. So they came up, the people used to drive the Jeeps, that these yellow lights, intense yellow lights, they're called fog lights, and cut through the fog. Despite the murkiness of the fog, it was able somehow to penetrate the fog. Life is a fog. A very thick fog. Total confusion. What's up is down, what's down is up. How do you somehow get some clarity, despite all the confusion? So King Solomon says, Ner mitzvah Torah or. Torah is the illuminator. Now, we ourselves are physical beings. We have a spiritual component within us, which is called our soul. But you realize you have no sense of that soul unless it's activated. What activates that soul? That it begins functioning as a spiritual component, and you have a sense of your spirituality. The only thing that can activate that soul, it's like you have a computer, you have to have a code. Once you put that code in, this computer has unlimited capability to process almost anything. But if you don't know that code, it's just a piece of iron and plastic and wires. That's about all it is. But if you know that code, you see what the capacity of that computer is. What is the code to our soul to activate us as spiritual beings? The Torah is the activator. That's Ner mitzvah Torah or. The Torah is the illuminator. Because the moment you ingest and partake of the Torah, all of a sudden your eyes open. When I say you see something, it means you have a sense to be able to internalize its value, the concepts, the perspectives, and understand the value of every aspect of what's presented to you to be able to appreciate its value. But without that being touched, without that orientation, A person has nasal passages, and you can have the most fragrant perfume. If the nasal passages are blocked, you smell nothing. But if you clear those passages and you inhale the aroma of that special perfume, you become totally enthralled by it. You become like overwhelmed positively with it. That's the pleasure you have. As a physical being, very few things resonate because we're physical. Material resonates very well. But spirituality, we're physical beings, how does it resonate? You have to open up those pores. You have to activate those nerve endings. You have to open all those passages. What clears those passages? What activates those nerve endings? What gets this entity functioning that it becomes primary in this edifice called the physical body? That's the Torah itself. When you engage in the Torah, and based on the level of quality that you engage, that will determine to what degree that computer or that edifice is activated. You study Torah with an ulterior motive. You study it at a very superficial level. You may be touched, but not much. You study it more intensely. You toil over it. You study it with reverence, with love, for the sake of God. Then you're getting a mega dose of this activation. And then you really start more than chugging along, but you really start moving and you start soaring. And you go in many directions and you begin realizing things which most people don't even begin understanding in terms of what value is. I'll give you an example. To be able to be qualified to go to MIT, it's not so simple. I once spoke to a person who was an astrophysicist. Not everybody can be an astrophysicist. You have to be able to comprehend and see things in a certain context. And if your mind is not geared in that context, you can be a very brilliant person. You can't relate to certain realities that exist within astrophysics. It's a whole different dimension. I'll give you an example, like a person's an architect. He's able to visualize things, and you need a certain type of mind to be able to see and comprehend and visualize, to be able to develop certain things to create that blueprint or that model. And if you have it, you have it. You don't have it, you don't have it. It has nothing to do with your intelligence. It's a capacity. A Jew has a capacity, but you have to activate it. You have to mentor it. You have to orient it. You have to somehow fire it up. It's like you fuel an oven. Years ago, the old Model T Fords, how did they get a car started? This is before you had a starter. You had a crank outside the car, and you turn that crank, and all of a sudden, the car starts coughing. It was called the carburetor, right? The carburetor. When you crank that thing, all of a sudden it starts coughing, and all of a sudden the person gets excited, jumps behind the wheel, and he better put his foot on that gas real quick, otherwise it stalls out. Now the question is, how do you crank yourself up? It's a process. It's not simple. Firstly, you have to study the right thing with the right mindset, the right commentary, the right belief. Intellectualism, are you doing because you believe in God and this is God's word? There's so many variables that have to be in place to be able to be touched by it. Years ago, I was giving a class, not going to mention names. It was a class every Thursday night from 6 to 7 on Madison Avenue. It was in the boardroom of the person who owned this very large office building. Must have been about 50 stories. And most of the people who attended the class were South Africans. And it was a class in Ramchal. And in the boardroom of the owner of this, he was a real estate mogul. He had a basket of yarmulkes. I'm not going to use the word kippot, because it was like the lining, like you have in a funeral parlor, the black linings of the skull caps. That's what they were. And whoever came into the class took one of these skull caps if they didn't have their own head covering. And we're in the middle of the class, and he pokes his head in, and he's not an observant man, and he's smoking a cigar which is about 14 inches long. And he was a relatively young man then. He was in his 50s. This person is today, in many years, is in Forbes 500. And he sticks his head in. So one of the people who were the South Africans attended the class, his name was David Tessel. And he speaks very elegantly with the South African accent. And he says, Mr. So-and-so, would you like to sit down and partake of the class? And has his teeth clenched on this 14-inch cigar. He says, I spent 12 years in Ramaz. I had enough. That's the way he said it. Yeah. Literally almost biting the cigar straight through. He didn't need a cigarette cutter, a cigar's cutter. He almost bit it through with his teeth. That's how tightly his teeth were clenched. He didn't even open his mouth to even say the words. He had enough. And that's why eventually the man divorced his Jewish wife, married a trophy wife. He has a trophy wife today. That's who he has. He has a Jewish name. Whatever it is. Does he have any relevance, any sense of his soul? He has no sense because he was never touched. And he only digs the hole deeper and deeper by following his own path in life to the point that he's defiant. There was a party this man attended, and all Jewish people there, maybe non-Jews, some too, and he took a piece of shrimp, and he said publicly in the group, he picked his head up and he dropped the shrimp down his throat. He said, look, I'm not dying. I'm not dying. The Torah says you're not permitted to eat shrimp. It's a non-kosher species. You're making a mockery of God. You know, Titus, who destroyed the Second Temple, he also challenged God. When he was taking the vessels of the temple back to Rome on a ship, all of a sudden there was gale winds and the ship was about to drown, sink. And he lifts his eyes to God. He says, sure, you took down Pharaoh in the sea. Your power's only in the sea. You come onto dry land, I'll fight you. This is what Titus says to God. God says, you know, I will take the smallest insect, and the moment you step on that dry land, your end will come through that insect. A tiny flea went up his nostril, into his brain, and it gnawed away at his brain to the point that eventually he died from this. And he suffered tremendously. When he died, they opened his skull. They found a bird with metal beak, bronze claws. It looked like a monster. This is this arrogant son of a gun, Titus, the Roman emperor. How could you be so arrogant? The answer is because he has no capacity, no relevance. He's an Edomite. But what about a Jew? A Jew has a special soul, but you could bury that soul so deeply. It's so deeply embedded in the physicality that you believe it doesn't even exist because it was never activated. All this grime, it accumulates over the years of life, over behavior, and we just continuously coat it and coat it. It's like you have a lead encasement. Everything is contained within, nothing radiates out of that lead encasement. It's an entombment. And people, they mummify themselves to that degree. Adam, before he ingested that fruit, which is evil, besides good, he naturally radiated. He pulsed. He had a pulsification of what? Pulsing holiness radiance. His spiritual nerve endings were primary in his existence. His clarity was there because at that moment, the soul wasn't impeded to any degree, and there was nothing blocking that radiance. And as it says, he shined. When he was created, the angels had mistaken his radiance for the radiance of God. And as they sing God's praises, they began singing his praises, thinking this is God. The moment he ate of the tree of knowledge, he was extinguished. It's like a brilliant light is put out, it's extinguished because he was physicalized. That entity called soul was entombed relative to what it was before. To be continued.
Thank you, Rabbi. Appreciate it. All the best, guys.
Yeah, that's good.
Rabbi, quick question.